So we're going to talk about some of the policies that are instituted to try to stop the spread of communism. These are mainly policies that are coming from the US. One of the important ideologies that we should first be familiar with is the policy of containment, which was first articulated by George Kennan, who was the US ambassador to the USSR. And in 1946, he wrote a memo to President Truman basically saying that, based on his experience in the USSR, it was his opinion that the USSR was out to disrupt the American way of life. So this kind of brings about the idea of containment, right? Like basically trying to prevent the spread of communism to places beyond where it already was. The idea was that the Iron Curtain might eventually expand farther outwards. In particular, the US was really concerned with the spread of communism to Asia, and we're going to see how that very much pans out in the future. So this also leads to the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which ultimately was a policy that remained in effect for the duration of the Cold War. The idea was that the U.S. would do anything it possibly could financially to help any country that was struggling to defeat communism. And one of the most prominent examples of the Truman Doctrine in action at its very beginning was in Greece. There was a civil war taking place. There were communist insurgencies breaking out throughout Greece, as well as Turkey, actually. Basically, what was happening was that there was a threat that both Greece and Turkey would fall to communist governments. And according to the policy of containment as well as the Truman Doctrine, this could not happen. Oh, sorry, this is so slow. But ultimately, the idea is, again, this point number 3 basically is the Truman Doctrine, the idea that the U.S. should support these free countries in any way possible, right? And the Truman Doctrine is, again, manifested in the aid to prevent Greece and Turkey to falling to communism by giving them $400 million. And as a result of this aid, Greece and Turkey do not become communist countries. You also see the incorporation of the Marshall Plan, which is named after the U.S. Secretary of State, George Marshall. And the idea behind the Marshall Plan was to help war-torn Europe recover. Remember when we talked about World War II, just the sheer physical devastation that we saw throughout Europe, basically because of course, massive air bombings, and so on, right? So what the Marshall Plan was again, this huge financial aid package to try to figure out how to rebuild Europe from the war. All right, and again, this is George Marshall here. Also, the important thing about the Marshall Plan was that it was all-inclusive, right? The idea was that it was that it would provide aid to any European nation. So this means that the Marshall Plan would help Eastern European countries recover. It would help countries that already were communist recover. So the idea, though, was, of course, to prevent communism from spreading into the really economically devastated regions. One of the things that the U.S. Felt made places more prone to communism was severe poverty, right? The idea was eventually the most impoverished classes would rise up and try to overthrow capitalism. And so by trying to aid these very poor countries, the idea was, if they were not communist already, to stop them from falling to it. And also, since the Marshall Plan was not exclusive, the idea also could be that a communist country that received aid due to the Marshall Plan might ultimately be influenced by the West. The Marshall Plan was huge financially. It was a little under $13 billion of aid. And again, it went to Western Europe primarily, but it also went to areas of Central Europe. Again, the U.S. said that it would extend aid to Eastern Europe and the USSR, but ultimately the Soviets, Stalin at the time, and then later Khrushchev, reject the extension of aid to these countries. Right? Again, the Soviets kind of saw the Marshall Plan as like a power play to extend the U.S. sphere of influence into Eastern Europe. Okay, so this is just sort of a graphic showing Stalin ultimately rejecting, trying to block the Marshall Plan from reaching Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Okay, the Marshall Plan was very successful. It resulted in in a significant economic recovery in Western and Central Europe. And just to give you an example, this is the same city. This photo is actually taken in the exact same spot, surprisingly. This is Stuttgart, Germany, and this is the city immediately after the war, and this is the city just a few years later due to the economic aid from the Marshall Plan. And again, this is significant, and we see this is not only helping out Germany, of course. Look at the significant aid to Great Britain and France in particular. And it's also important for us to just take a step back and realize that that Germany had been one of our enemies during World War II, and yet they are recovering significantly because of the Marshall Plan. So it's important to realize that very quickly West Germany becomes ultimately a friend to countries like the United States. And of course, the main issue here is how to ultimately, hopefully, gain influence over Eastern Europe again, which Stalin is very much trying to block. And with that said, let's turn to what is going on in Berlin. And this is a map of all of Germany. We discussed last time how Germany was divided into 4 different zones, right? And we see this here again. So the Western zones, right, Great Britain, France, and the United States, and then the Eastern zone, which was dominated by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union also, the interesting thing about that is that the capital of Germany, Berlin, which is approximately here, also was divided into 4 zones. But that is kind of problematic for Stalin because, of course, this is a zone that has Westerners, that has capitalists in it, but yet is surrounded by East Germany. So what Stalin attempts to do, what all the Soviets try to do, is get rid of the Allied influence from Berlin. They want to basically make it so that all of Berlin was communist in nature. So what the Soviets try to do is remove all the Allies from Berlin by basically blockading any access into the city from the west. So all these roads, remember that the Autobahn was set up as part of Hitler's economic recovery plan in the 1930s. So all these highways, all these land routes into East Germany were blocked off by the Soviets. So basically, what they were trying to do was starve out all these Westerners from Berlin. So this is referred to as the Berlin Blockade. But the ultimate result of this was that the U.S. organized this huge airlift. It sent over 200,000 flights into Berlin. At its peak, there were actually flights landing every 45 seconds into Berlin. And basically, these flights were carrying in food, medicine, and lots of other supplies to basically keep these allies in the city of Berlin. And this is really important because prior to the airlift, this blockade reached a point that was so tense that some people thought that ultimately this could escalate into World War III, right? The idea was, if it wasn't for the airlift, there was at least a thought that Truman might have to respond militarily to stop the blockade into Berlin. But fortunately, it did not come to that, and the airlift was successful. And after 11 months of the blockade, Stalin eventually lifted the blockade because the airlift was successful. So I guess this is a good example, actually, of containment working in a sense, because communism did not spread to take over all of Berlin. Okay, in response to the Berlin crisis, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is founded in 1949. All right, so again, the idea is NATO, right? The idea is for it to basically establish collective security to prevent any Soviet expansion in Europe, right? They saw the Berlin crisis as a serious threat. They saw it as, again, an example of how the Soviets could expand even further into Europe. The fear was that not only would they take over the city of Berlin, but they might push farther into West Germany and even farther beyond that. So NATO basically was this organization consisting of all these democratic countries. Prominent ones were throughout Western Europe, the US and Canada, right? And at first it had 12 member nations. And the idea was that if any of these nations were attacked by the Soviets, that all the other nations in NATO would come to its defense. So we see the original countries that belong to NATO here. Important to note that Greece and Turkey, which again were just saved, so to speak, from their civil wars, are part of NATO. So the USSR responds to NATO. Also another thing that's really important is that West Germany joins NATO. All right, so because West Germany joins, the USSR responds out of anger, essentially, by forming their own version of NATO, which was called the Warsaw Pact. All right, and this was founded in 1955. And again, it's similar to NATO because it's this collective security agency, right? The idea is that if any Western country attacks any Warsaw Pact member, that they would come to its defense. All right, so Warsaw Pact, again, just sort of the answer to NATO. You can see here just the two organizations against one another. Again, you see this Iron Curtain line descending over the two, right? So again, important actually also to realize that, interestingly, Albania, which is beyond the Iron Curtain, actually is here. We see, of course, part of the Warsaw Pact. But it's important for us to know that, I guess the ultimate takeaway from this is that NATO actually still exists. NATO now has 26 countries. But now its mission obviously is beyond the Cold War because the Cold War is over. So ultimately now it's still seen as a collective security agency. We saw it responding to the 9/11 attacks, for example. But the important part about NATO and the Warsaw Pact here in history was that, again, just like the Iron Curtain articulated, Europe was now effectively divided into these two hostile blocs. Okay, so containment continued. In 1949, the People's Republic of China is established under Mao Zedong. This symbolizes the victory of the Chinese communists over the Chinese nationalists. There was a long period of civil war in China between these two groups for a while, and of course the Americans and Westerners supported the nationalists in China, like Chiang Kai-shek, who ultimately were overthrown in 1949 and ended up retreating and living on the island of Taiwan. So what's important to this is that because China is so huge and because it becomes communist, it is seen as a huge loss to the US, right? They see it as a huge blow to the policy of containment, right? Because the world's most populous country is now communist. So it's important to realize that as a result of China becoming communist, the United States realizes it really needs to flex its muscle if the policy of containment is going to work. And another thing that happens that's important in that same year is that the USSR successfully tests and explodes its first atomic bomb. So this shows us that now the US is not alone in its nuclear capacities. So an opportunity for the US to kind of further influence the spread, or further stop the spread of communism, that is, through the policy of containment, takes place in the Korean War. From 1950 to 1953. So it's important, just a little bit of background, that Korea was divided after it was originally dominated by Japan during World War II, but then ultimately after World War II ended, it was divided sort of arbitrarily along the 38th parallel here, and the northern part of Korea was influenced by China, so it became communist, right, and it was supported by the Soviets. Its president was Kim Il-sung, and then the southern part of Korea was influenced by the U.S. and the UN in general. It was capitalist in nature, and it had a president, Syngman Rhee, represented here. So what happens is that North Korea wants to ultimately kind of reunify and become communist entirely. So starting in 1950, the North Koreans invade South Korea, and then the UN makes the decision to respond to it militarily. So the United Nations ends up voting to send forces into Korea to try to push the North Koreans back across the 38th border into their own area. And it's important to realize that the whole reason why the UN successfully voted for this was because, this should say USSR, my apologies. The USSR was boycotting the UN at the time because the UN was not letting China into the Security Council. All right, so that's one of the only reasons why they were able to vote for war. At first, the United Nations is successful. They do push the North Koreans back into North Korea, but ultimately their failure, so to speak, is that the U.S. General George MacArthur actually continues to push the North Korean soldiers even farther up to the Yalu River, which is the border of North Korea and China here. The Chinese troops sort of get nervous. They end up sending hundreds of thousands of troops to aid the North Koreans. This eventually results in stalemate along the border, and eventually, sorry, this line is a little bit skewed here, but by 1953, after several years of stalemate, ultimately there is a ceasefire that's reached, and the border is restored at the 38th parallel. So it's more or less the same. Again, this line should be over here. But I get, in a way, it's a success of the policy of containment because communism doesn't spread farther, but still,